Okay, so what we want to do in this video is talk about the second non-price determinant of demand which causes a shift. So the first non-price determinant of demand which causes a shift is taste of the consumer. The second non-price determinant of demand is other related goods, or the prices of other related goods. So let's remind ourselves what an outward shift of the demand curve is. What we're saying here is that the entire demand curve shifts to the right, which means that every effective price more is bought, and this is called an increase in demand. Okay, an inward shift of the demand curve is when the entire demand curve shifts to the left. At every effective price more is bought, and this is called a decrease in demand. Now, what I would ask you to do is, I'm not going to go through this, but pause the video, have a look at these questions and see if you can answer what happens to the amount of a good that people will buy following these changes listed on the screen. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to think about that. So we're going to give a bit of background now. There are two types of related goods. Okay, the first one is substitute goods, and the second one are complements or complementary goods. Okay, so we need to know what we're talking about before we talk about something. So what's the definition of a substitute good? A substitute good is a good that can fulfill the same function as the good in question, or two goods that satisfy similar needs. So if we're talking about cola soft drinks, we've got Coca-Cola or Pepsi. Now, just to be clear, it does massively depend on your own personal preferences. So for me, I just don't like Pepsi. So Pepsi is not a substitute good for Coke, in my opinion. Okay, I'm from Ireland. I'd always ask for a Club Orange. If they didn't have Coke in the restaurant, I'd ask for a Club Orange instead. Okay, so that's just down to preferences. But for the moment, most people think that Pepsi and Coke are similar. Another type is a washing up powder, which is Daz versus Persil. They do similar jobs. They fulfill similar needs. Okay, they fulfill the same function as each other. That's what a substitute is. A complement or complementary goods are goods that tend to be used together or are in joint demand. So with cigarettes, if you're ever going to smoke, which I would never advise, but if you choose to do, what else do you need other than cigarettes in order to smoke? And the answer is a lighter. If you're going to drive a car, most likely it is a petrol driven car. So if you have a car, you're most likely going to need gasoline. Okay, so they are examples. First of all, remember what a substitute good is and examples of those, and then example of that, a substitute good, and complementary goods and examples of complements as well. The reason why I say that is because if you don't remember those things, quickly go back and read or listen to the video, but try and answer these questions here. I'll tell you just quickly, I'll repeat, a substitute good is a good that can fill the same function as the good in question, or two goods that satisfy similar needs like Coke and Pepsi. And a complementary good is goods that tend to be used together or are in joint demand. But I would like you to have a look at these questions and see if you can answer them. So pause the video. Once you reckon you have an answer, have a go, press play, and then we'll go through the answers. Okay, so the first thing is now the rise in the price of a substitute good. So we're going to assume that Coke and Pepsi are substitutes for you and I. Now, if we have a rise, this here represents the demand curve for Coca-Cola. If Pepsi rises in price, because they are closely related, the two goods, Coke and Pepsi, are closely related, what will happen is at least some consumers may switch from buying Pepsi to buying Coke. So this is the demand curve for Coke. The price of Pepsi rises, people switch to buying more Coke, and that means that at every single price, more is bought. Now, how do we represent that? Well, I'm only, going to represent that at one price, but at every effective price, more Coke is now bought because people are switching from Pepsi to Coca-Cola. There is an outward shift. So if the price of a substitute rises, there is an outward shift for the good in question. Now, if this again is the demand curve for Coke and the price of Pepsi falls, well then what will happen is some consumers of Coke may switch from buying Coke to buying the cheaper substitute, which is Pepsi. And as such, this represents itself as an inward shift in the demand curve, showing that at every effective price, less Coke is bought following a fall in the price of Pepsi. Okay, both of those are substitute goods, the prices of substitute goods done. Now, we're talking about this here is the demand for big cars. Okay, so what happens to the demand for big cars, assuming they're petrol cars, of course, if the price of petrol, a complement, falls? Well, if the price of petrol falls, what that means is it is cheaper to operate a big car. And as such, people will respond to incentives and potentially buy more cars. This should or may lead to an outward shift in the demand curve for big cars. And we say at every effective price, more big cars are bought following a fall in the price of petrol. Now, on the other hand, if the price of petrol rises, well, what happens to the demand for big cars? Well, the operating cost of owning and operating a big car has increased. Therefore, at least eventually over a few years, if the high price maintains itself, high price of petrol, there will be a reduction in the amount or number of big cars demanded. And this represents itself by an inward shift of the demand curve, and just showing at price P1, but it is at every effective price less big cars are bought. So what you need to know at the end of this video is the definition of a substitute goods and complementary goods, examples of substitute goods and complementary goods, and how changes in the prices of each of these goods affect the demand curve.